Because ID has strong arguments, it is persuading prominent people, and we've seen high-level converts to intelligent design, including faculty at top institutions, even including Nobel laureates.
Over time, intelligent design has become a catchphrase. Whether this is what the researchers within the field mean by it or not, it's become a catchphrase that people will use to talk about any view that can vaguely equate God and some kind of scientific view of looking at the universe.
Hello, welcome along to another edition of the show. Really excited about my guests today. I'm joined by Casey Luskin and Adam Shapiro. We'll talk about our subject in a moment's time. If you're watching here on YouTube, though, we'd love you to like today's video, subscribe to the channel. Make sure to keep up to date with Unbelievable by also subscribing to our newsletter, where you can get all the latest from the show. Well, today we're asking, is the intelligent design movement on the advance or in retreat? To debate the issues, I'm joined by Casey Luskin, an Associate Director at the Discovery Institute. He's also a scientist and attorney by background. He's an increasingly recognised voice in the area of intelligent design and editor of a new book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Opposite Casey today is Adam Shapiro, a historian of science and religion. Adam is a critic of intelligent design theory and also a co-author of a recent book, a new edition of Science and Religion, a very short introduction with Thomas Dixon. So today we'll be asking where the ID movement is since it hit the headlines some 16 years ago with the famous, or should I say infamous, Kitzmiller versus Dover School Board trial, which ruled against ID being taught in school. But has ID continued to make strides or been on the back foot since then? And should people of faith be appealing to the complexity of life in order to make the case for a creator? All these and more questions will be discussed on the show today. So Casey and Adam, welcome along to the programme today. Let's start with you, Casey, both new to the show, but tell us about the Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, because this was really the thing that made me want to bring you on in the first place. It's a very thick tome, isn't it? I've got it on my desk. It's propping up a book somewhere. It's quite a significant piece of work. So tell us about it.
Thanks. Yeah, it makes a good paperweight. No, thank you so much, Justin, and thanks to Adam for being here and being willing to have this conversation. The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith is a book that I co-edited last year with Joseph Holden and William Dembski. Joseph Holden is a philosopher and not really associated with intelligent design. William Dembski is a person that probably many of your listeners and viewers have heard of. He's a mathematician and a philosopher and one of the intellectual founders of the intelligent design movement. The book was actually really organized by Joseph Holden when I was still knee deep in my PhD in geology in South Africa around probably the year 2018, 2019. And I had no time at that point to think about co-editing a book. But he said, let's do it when you're done with a PhD. And in the interim, he kind of organized a lot of the contributors. In fact, I think many of the invitations to people to contribute were sent out when I was midair flying home from South Africa in March of 2020, trying to flee South Africa before their borders closed just as the coronavirus hit.
Wow.
So I didn't even get to be involved with some of the initial organization, but it's a great book that covers many topics on science and faith. It has a diverse collection of contributors. Some of them are ID related, some not. I was very involved with organizing and editing many of the ID chapters with contributors from folks like Stephen Meyer, Jonathan Wells, Michael Behe, Douglas Axe, Gunter Beckley, Walter Bradley, Paul Nelson, Guillermo Gonzalez, Brian Miller, and a lot of great scientists and folks in the ID community. And it addresses common topics in intelligent design like, is intelligent design a scientific theory backed by evidence in fields like biology or physics? Are human beings unique? Do we share a common ancestor with other species? And also topics that address sort of the science-religion dialogue, like has religion contributed positively to the development of science, or is this warfare model of between science and religion the best way to look at it? So it really is a comprehensive guide. I think the chapters in the book are concise, yet packed with a lot of information that'll help readers get up to speed on issues very quickly. So I think it'll be a very useful book.
But having said all that, it's not just intelligent design focused, is it? I mean, you deal quite a lot with the sort of the history of science, well before the intelligent design movement came into being in its modern form and so on.
That's right. It's much broader than intelligent design. There are sections that deal with science and faith, that deal with, questions about the problem of evil. Again, These were organized, a lot of them by Joseph Holden, a philosopher and theologian. So it's very broad. Intelligent design is part of it, but it does get into quite a few hot topics, like it takes an old earth Christian perspective. And so there's some articles that are looking at how you can reconcile an old earth with a Christian viewpoint, and those kinds of sort of hot button topics that people like to think about.
Yeah, great stuff. Obviously, and it's the comprehensive guide to science and faith, but very much with your perspective on it. Obviously, it comes obviously with the sort of the stamp of the scientific and theological perspective of, and as any book will inevitably, depending on who writes it. So I imagine if Adam writes the comprehensive guide to science and faith, it might go in different directions to you. And in a way, you've not written the comprehensive guide, but you've written a guide. It's Science and Religion, in this case, a very short introduction. So the size of the book is somewhat different to Casey's one. But tell us, Adam, a bit about yourself firstly, and then about this new project, this second edition of this book.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. I'm really glad to have a chance to chat with you and to chat with Casey as well about these questions. I think you're right that if Casey's new book is this, it goes for comprehensive. The keywords, of course, in our title are very short, which may be a selling point for some readers, especially people who want to get their toes wet in this field and understand how it is that two things that seem like they have nothing to do with one another actually do interact and engage both historically and in the present, without necessarily investing in the amount of detail and richness of detail that scholarship around the world has provided for so long. One of the difficulties with writing something called a very short introduction is the necessary decision-making that goes into what do you include and what do you exclude. Fortunately for me, my co-author Thomas Dixon published the first edition of this back in 2008, which is the core of the book, although we did quite a lot of work rewriting, adding new sections, and in some cases redacting and condensing some sections. But it's also, I think, important to recognize that both Thomas and I are historians. And so our approach to this field, training is in the history and philosophy of science. Our approach to this is not just to try to answer the question, science versus religion, which side is right? As much as I know people sort of have an appetite for debate, often our question is to say, how did there come to be something that was seen as two different sides that were asking different questions, whether that was inevitable from the kinds of issues that they deal with, or whether that was historically contingent. But also to say, as historians, that we don't just look at ideas. We look at how those ideas are embodied in the world. We look at the people who believe in them and talk about them. We look at the communities that act because of those ideas. And we look at the people who are affected by those ideas, regardless of whether they hold to them or not. So to give you some examples of some of the things we include in the new edition, we talk a bit more about the history of medical missionaries and the role that science and religion both play in creating kind of the colonial and eventually post-colonial world, in creating certain sort of exalted forms of knowledge, where sometimes science and religion are on the same side of an issue. And those are questions that we're still seeing happening today. To some extent, the history of the debates over evolution was one of the places where we felt like we could actually condense a bit compared to the first edition. That could be because, as you alluded to at the outset, the Dover-Kitzmiller trial, which had taken place just a few years before the first edition came out, had really fascinated people and really focused a lot of attention on this question of evolution versus intelligent design, evolution versus other alternatives to evolution, or for that matter, theistic versus atheistic interpretations of evolution. We still talk about those issues, but we felt like there was perhaps more pressing issues going on right now that needed to get more attention than the first edition had done.
Great. Well,
that being said, happy to talk more about intelligent design.
Well, absolutely,
today.
And I appreciate you coming on to kind of put the focus on intelligent design, even though that obviously isn't specifically the focus of the book you've written there. But I will make sure to link from today's show so people can get hold of this second edition of Science and Religion, a very short introduction. Many years ago, you'd have to go way back in the unbelievable archives. I have had Thomas Dixon on the show as well, and again, I think debating similar issues at the time. But Casey, let's return to you, and again, perhaps a good place to start as we kind of start to unpack this question at the center of this is the intelligent design movement on the advance or in retreat, is simply for you to first of all define what you understand intelligent design to be, and give us a sense of what your view is on the current state of play in the field. Obviously, you've got a vested interest in it to some extent, but let's hear you lay that out first, and then we'll hear Adam's perspective.
Sure. Well, vested or not, I think that there is very good evidence that the intelligent design movement is on the advance, and I look forward to talking about this. So what is intelligent design? Intelligent design is a scientific theory which holds that many aspects of life in the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than undirected causes, such as natural selection. And I appreciate, Adam, that you're a historian. My expertise is certainly not in your area, so I don't want to take this too far into the weeds of the science, but I do think it's important for us to have a basic sketch of intelligent design arguments so that our listeners can know what we're talking about. So here's how the argument for intelligent design works. And I think that this is one of the reasons why intelligent design is on the advance, is because intelligent design has a very powerful and persuasive argument. So intelligent design is based upon our observations from nature and the world around us, that when intelligent agents act, they create high levels of what we call complex and specified information, or CSI for short. Information is basically a reduction in uncertainty. So, for example, if I were to tell you that there's water falling from the sky, that would give you information that reduces your uncertainty about what the weather might be outside. So what is CSI, or complex and specified information? Well, something is complex if it is unlikely, and it's specified if it matches an independent pattern. So some examples of CSI would be language or code. So for example, the words that are coming out of my mouth right now represent a very unlikely series of vibrations in sound molecules. That means that they are complex. Yet they represent a pattern that matches what we all recognize to be sounds that conform to the English language. So we would recognize that these sounds are intelligently designed, or at least I hope they are. So what ID theorists do is they make a hypothesis. They use the scientific method that we see in every biology textbook: observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion. They make a hypothesis that if a natural structure was designed, it will contain high CSI, and we can test for high CSI through experiments and other forms of scientific investigations. As one of quite a few examples, protein scientist Douglas Axe published mutational sensitivity tests in the Journal of Molecular Biology, which were funded by Discovery Institute, by the way, his research, which showed that the likelihood of a chance sequence of amino acids forming a functional beta-lactamase enzyme in E. coli was less than 10 to the 74th power. That means that beta-lactamase enzymes have an amino acid sequence that is very rare, meaning it's unlikely, it's complex, but also highly specified to be able to destroy the beta-lactam ring that's found in many antibiotics. And this allows these bacteria to survive antibiotics like penicillin. So to give you a sense of why such CSI is beyond natural processes, there have been only 10 to the 40th organisms that have lived on Earth in its entire 4.5 billion year history. So if we grant the totally unreasonably generous assumption that every single organism that has ever lived has been gifted with a newly random sequence of 150 amino acids that can produce a genuinely novel protein, we would still be some 10 to the 34th trial short of being able to create a functional, stable beta-lactamase enzyme. So when we find high CSI like this in nature, we are justified in concluding design. There's both a positive argument for design and a negative argument that natural causes are not up to the task. And the positive argument comes from finding in nature the kind of information and complexity, which in our experience only comes from intelligence. And of course, our conclusion of design is held scientifically. We hold it tentatively, subject to future investigations, and maybe it'll be overturned. Maybe it'll turn out to be wrong. So we hold the conclusion tentatively. But sort of to boil the ID argument down into one, quick snippet, I would say that the past 50 years of biological research have shown that life is fundamentally based upon a vast amount of complex and specified information encoded in a biochemical language in our DNA. Sorry, I stabbed my thumb the other day, so I'm showing my Band-Aid here. A computer-like system of commands and codes that processes the information in the DNA. And then the result of that information processing is irreducibly complex molecular machines and multi-machine systems. But where in our experience do things like complex and specified information, programming code, and machine-like structures come from? They have only one known source, and that's intelligence. So again, we have a positive argument for design based upon finding in nature the kind of information and complexity which in our experience comes from intelligence. And I'll make a couple brief points that I'll elaborate later in the conversation, but because ID has strong arguments, it is persuading prominent people, and we've seen high-level converts to intelligent design, including faculty at top institutions, even including Nobel laureates, like Brian Josephson, a physicist at Cambridge University, who said that far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science. And a number of other converts maybe we can talk about. I could go on and on like this, but we have scientists that are contacting us at Discovery Institute from all over the world on a regular basis saying that they support intelligent design. It keeps us very busy doing Zoom chats with newly discovered scientists coming out of the woodwork, expressing their support of ID. And a huge amount of our time is consumed with sort of fostering this network of ID-friendly scientists around the world, as well as the small army of now over 600 students that have graduated from our annual summer seminar on intelligent design. And that includes many ID-friendly PhD students, postdocs, and junior faculty that have gone through the program and are now pursuing careers doing ID research. So there's a great, and we can talk about this more, but there's a very exciting and active ID research program that is publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals and showing that ID can be used as a heuristic to create testable predictions in the laboratory that can guide scientific discovery. So there's a lot to talk about. In addition, I think ID is in advance because naturalistic models of evolution are in retreat. We can talk about all this in more detail.
Well, thank you. That's been very comprehensive, just as the book is when it comes to the subject of ID. And I'd be fascinated to talk about the converts as you describe them a bit later on, because I think that would be very interesting to see who's coming out of the woodwork. And obviously, that there have been claims that it's been very difficult for people to be open if they are sympathetic to ID in academia and so on. But we'll maybe come back to that. Adam, let me give you a chance though to sort of lay out your perspective on all this. So, firstly, whether you broadly agree or not with the way in which intelligent design has been represented there, and how you generally tend to respond to it as a movement.
Sure. Well, so as I had said previously, my background into this is as a historian and philosopher of science. And a lot of my own academic research has been on the history of ideas about how religious interpretations of evolution or non-evolution have played out in the public. And so I want to just to set out some lines of distinction, I think, at first, because there are lots of people who will say that they believe in both God and evolution. And is that the same thing as believing in an intelligent design? Some people might say yes, and some people might not say yes. It depends on what they mean by intelligent design. Casey's given you a couple of different, I think, are both what he would call arguments for intelligent design, and in some ways that means also different ways of identifying what intelligent design is. When you talk about there being both positive and negative arguments, somebody who says, I believe that nature shows me the handiwork of God, may or may not necessarily agree with the kinds of negative argumentation that some of your colleagues, Casey, have put forward. But they would say that in nature they see, whether through scientific analysis or through their own sort of spiritual experience or through their own emotional reaction to the nature around them, that they feel that there is God. I don't want to say that the only alternative to intelligent design is an atheistic vision of evolution. There are plenty of atheists who believe in evolution, but clearly there are also plenty of people who find points of overlap or points of reconciliation between the two. I think that what has happened over time, and I think this is something that Casey might be willing to agree to, is that over time intelligent design has become a catchphrase. Whether this is what the researchers within the field mean by it or not, it's become a catchphrase that people will use to talk about any view that can vaguely equate God and some kind of scientific view of looking at the universe. That is to say, there are a lot of people who in the past might have been referred to as theistic evolutionist, which to some people is not considered an ideal term, is a questionable term. And they might say, well, I believe there's an intelligent designer to the world. Whether they mean by that the same thing theologically, the same thing philosophically, as what some of the arguments put forward by the fellows of the Discovery Institute mean, I think is something that we would need to dig a little bit deeper into. My own research particularly has been on the history of natural theology in the 19th century. And if you're familiar, if your viewers and listeners are familiar with kind of the standard story of debates about Darwin and design, they are probably familiar with the debates about William Paley and the story of the watchmaker. The idea that if one were to find a watch randomly out in a field somewhere and examine the watch, one would use that watch to infer that there was in fact a maker behind that watch, that something had intentionally put the pieces of that watch together for a reason. And one of the things that I've spelled out in my research, and which we talk a little bit about in the new book, is the fact that natural theological arguments have in some ways been horribly maligned and sort of misrepresented throughout the past 200 years. Most famously, of course, one of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker, in which he claimed a watch could essentially come about without any intelligent designer whatsoever. I think that's based on a misreading of what Paley's argument philosophically and theologically is trying to do. But I do think that some of the early writing in the intelligent design movement, while disagreeing with Dawkins, accepted the framework that he laid out and decided that the question was essentially, could some complex mechanism in biology or elsewhere in nature come about through non-intelligent agency? The question of origins being the central question is something that is not historically always been the case. And so for me, I think that the real groundwork is to say, what are the aims and goals? You asked the question, is the intelligent design movement in advance or in retreat? I think that's separate from asking the question about whether intelligent design as a concept is in advance or in retreat. But I think it also requires the sort of clarification between intelligent design as, say, the group of contributors to Casey's new book would have it, and the intelligent design that's getting talked about by school boards and on internet chat rooms, which sometimes is easily conflated with other forms of creationism, with theistic evolution, and really with anything that just rejects atheism.
Well, thank you for that perspective. I mean, Casey, did you want to add anything sort of on the back of Adam's sort of helpful kind of distinctions of the different sort of ways in which intelligent design is sometimes thought about?
Well, I want to say I agree very much with Adam that there is certainly more than one view out there than just intelligent design and atheistic evolution. I mean, the ID movement published a 1,000-page book in 2017 titled Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique, which discusses those who believe that God used purely evolutionary mechanisms to create life. Sometimes they call themselves evolutionary creationists. I'm not sure if that's a great term, but it's certainly a view that's out there. I think that where intelligent design would be distinguished from that view is that the theistic evolution or evolutionary creation camp, often represented by the folks at BioLogos, they don't think that we can scientifically detect design in nature. Either we cannot detect it or we have not detected it. Whereas intelligent design proponents, I mean, this is not a theological view. This is an argument that we're making based upon science to show that we think that you can make a case from the scientific evidence that there is design in nature, both in biology and in physics and cosmology. And it's important to understand that within the intelligent design movement, there are people with a variety of different theological beliefs and backgrounds. There are some folks who call themselves atheists. In fact, you want to talk about more high-level converts to intelligent design. New York University philosopher and legal scholar Thomas Nagel, a very well-known atheist, published a book, Mind and Cosmos, with Oxford University Press in 2012, where he defended intelligent design. He said that intelligent design arguments have merit, that they've stimulated his thinking, and that we don't deserve a lot of the abuse that we get in the intelligent design movement. It's a very fun book to read. And there are other folks who would call themselves atheists who find that ID arguments have merit. So clearly intelligent design is not united by some theological premise about, how to reconcile faith and science, or how to interpret Genesis, or even who the designer is. It's united by a conviction that there is scientific evidence for design in nature. And we can talk more about school boards if you want. We might get into that. A big part of my job at Discovery Institute since 2005 has been to advise school boards on what to teach. And Discovery Institute actually has long, even before Dover, told school boards in the United States, when public schools come to us, that we do not think that intelligent design should be pushed into public schools, because our priority is to see it grow and develop as a science, not to see it become a political hot potato. The Dover case, that Dover school board rejected our advice. We can talk about that more if we want, but but I do agree with Adam very much. There's a lot more than just ID and atheistic evolution. It's a very complicated issue.
And Adam, coming back to you on that, I, in a sense, that's interesting that Casey says, actually, as far as he's concerned, they're really not that interested in a kind of theology necessarily. There's a variety of theological perspectives in their camp. It is about the science. Now, do you agree with that, or do you think it's kind of has always intrinsically been sort of, related to a kind of theological or religious perspective?
I don't know if I would say intrinsically, but I think that if we look at the historical context, or again, remember the question of looking at sort of the question of not just the ideas themselves, but who's using these ideas, who's advocating these ideas, and who's being affected by those ideas. There's no question that the claims of intelligent design being a legitimate scientific alternative to a Darwinian model of evolution has been used by, and I think Casey would say misused in the case of, say, Dover, by school boards who saw this as an opportunity to effectively bring religion into a school curriculum in a particular way. But I think at the same time, I'm actually very interested in the question about whether it makes sense for various religious groups to appreciate these arguments the way that Casey is laying them out. Casey just pointed out that there are people within the intelligent design movement who come from different theological backgrounds. And there are certainly critics from Christian and other religious perspectives of the intelligent design movement who basically are pointing to that fact and saying that this is, from a theological perspective, unsatisfactory. There was just an article this week from Answers in Genesis, the Young Earth Creationist group headquartered here in the United States, basically arguing that one of the real problems that they saw with intelligent design is that even if one proves that there is this supernatural designer, or that there are instances in which something was created by a process of supernatural design, that the way that has been detected or argued for does not allow for further speculation or inquiry or philosophical reasoning to be built upon it that can tell you anything about the idea that intelligent designer is God, is a specific kind of God with specific moral or Christological or eschatological concerns. So from a theological perspective, and this is something I think that we see going back to the natural theology movement from the 1800s, the question has never ever been proving the mere existence of something, but proving the existence of something in a way that you can do something useful with. I don't know that, I understand that in the interest of the intelligent design movement to focus on sort of maintaining an identity as a science, it in some ways shies away from these theological questions, but it's quite clear that at least some of the people within this movement have been very explicit about their theological commitments and as you said, Casey, in this new book, trying to show how intelligent design can be reconciled with Scripture, how it can be reconciled with various other aspects of theological life.
Let me come back to that, Casey. I'm going to just go to a break, and we'll be back in just 1 second, and I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that. But we're talking about intelligent design. It's been a little while since we've talked about this on Unbelievable, but we're asking a sort of big question: is it on the advance or in retreat? It was interesting, and I'll tell you a story when we come back from the break about why I thought this was an interesting way of putting it, framing the question, because I approached a number of people, including yourself, Adam. I was very glad that you said yes, because a number of people said no, and I'll tell you why to having this conversation in a moment's time. But we'll be back in just a moment here on the show that aims to get you thinking, and my guests today, Adam Shapiro and Casey Luskin. Can you hear me? Is this working? We've all got used to muting and unmuting ourselves in recent years, but in our confused and divided culture, when Christians feel nervous about speaking up, it feels like God has been put on mute too. Well, this May, Premier Unbelievable the Conference is coming live from the British Library London as leading thinkers help the church and you to find your authentic voice again. Alistair McGrath, John Wyatt, Lisa Fields, Glenn Scrivener, Sharon Dirks, Joseph D'Souza, Phil Vischer, Skye Jitani, and more guests will show how Christians can speak with truth and grace in troubled times. Plus, there'll be the global launch of our brand new ministry, helping skeptics to explore faith and Christians to share their faith with confidence. Not only that, your ticket includes our live Big Conversation event with renowned brain psychologist Ian McGilchrist and Christian neuroscientist Sharon Dirks on whether there's a master who made our mind. You can attend in person or online from anywhere in the world. So join me, Justin Brierley, on Saturday, the 14th of May for this year's conference. Find out more at unbelievable.live, and let's take God off mute. Welcome back to the show. We're asking today, is the intelligent design movement on the advance or in retreat? Casey Luskin from the Discovery Institute joins us. He's the editor of a new book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Adam Shapiro also, who's a historian of science and religion, and also the co-author of a new edition of Science and Religion, A Very Short Introduction. And just in that last segment, Adam was really saying, Casey, that, broadly speaking, yes, there has traditionally been theological kind of motivations perhaps behind intelligent design, though he obviously says that may not be the case across the board. It tends to express itself differently. So yeah, where do you go with this? And I did promise to tell a little story, which is I did approach some other folk before finding Adam, who I think is a great representative for this discussion. But a lot of the pushback I had was along the lines of, this debate's been done, it's dead, we've all moved on. Dover Kitzmiller was a long time ago. They're beating a dead horse, these intelligent design theorists at this point. And yet when I hear you, Casey, saying there's converts, there's ever more increasing information, of the complexity and the specified information, everything, I hear a very different story. So, I kind of want to dig into that as well. Why we're hearing such different things from different people when it comes to intelligent design. But feel free to first of all respond to what Adam had to say, and then perhaps you could pick up on my question.
Sure. And I think rumors of ID's death have been greatly exaggerated. We've been declared dead so many times that, I don't know, coroners must be very busy because we're constantly being told that we're dead. But yeah, we're still here, and in fact, we're growing. And we'll talk more. I'm drooling to talk about that, so we'll get into that. But Adam highlights an interesting point that really shows that ID is different from creationism. There are major creationist groups that don't like intelligent design because it does not address certain theological questions that are very important to them, such as saying that the designer is the God of the Bible, or, how to interpret Genesis. But does that mean that intelligent design should not appeal to Christians? Well, look, I'm a Christian. The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith comes at this from a Christian perspective in many of the chapters. I never try to hide the fact I'm a Christian. In fact, I make it a point to make it clear that I'm a Christian, whether I'm speaking to religious or secular audiences. So across the board, ID proponents, whether they are Christians or Jews or Muslims or agnostics or Hindus or atheists, and we got all of them in our movement, across the board, we're very open about where we're coming from. There's no secrets about our own personal convictions. But I always make it clear that my personal view that the God of the Bible is the designer is something that I hold for religious reasons that are outside the scope of intelligent design. Intelligent design, however, is still of great interest to people of faith or not of faith. Anyone who wants to answer the timeless question of, is there evidence that the universe is the result of unguided material causes, or is there evidence that it is the result of purposeful and intelligent design? The atheist psychologist Michael Shermer, in his book Why We Believe, cites a survey which said that arguments over whether there is design in nature is one of the number one reasons why people are either skeptics or religious. Okay, so wherever you're coming from, this topic of intelligent design should be of interest to you. And so I would say, look, the arguments for design have a scientific basis. There are no religious premises in the arguments that I gave you in that first segment, explaining the arguments for and the evidence for intelligent design in brief outline. It's a strictly scientific argument. However, certainly scientific arguments can have religious implications. People would say that Darwinism has had religious implications, or the Big Bang has had, there are many scientific theories that have been said to have religious implications. Many people take the idea that there is a designer behind life in the universe to be epistemically friendly towards theism. If you want to take a Bayesian approach, the idea that there's design in nature is more probable on theism than it is under atheism. Okay, so we can make an argument like that. But as far as intelligent design goes, I understand that a lot of Christians, or in particular some young earth creationists, feel like it doesn't go far enough as far as making a case for the God of the Bible. Well, I agree with that. As a Christian, intelligent design is what it is. It was never meant to be a full-blown apologetic argument for Christ dying on the cross for your sins. It was meant to be a scientific argument that there is design in nature, and in doing so, it addresses a very important worldview question that every single human being has to answer for themselves. Is there design in the universe or not? Okay. And so I think that idea is of great value, even if it doesn't go so far as to address, who is the designer. And we can address those questions, by the way, through other apologetic arguments from history and philosophy and theology. If you want to, make a case for God being the creator, you can go outside of intelligent design and get into other topics. I'm not saying you can't do that. Of course, those are important things to do, but that's not what intelligent design does. It's a scientific case for intelligent design. I didn't get into the more how ideas advancing. We'll have to do that.
We'll come back to that. We will come back to that. But Adam, just before you respond to that, I'd just be fascinated to know, because I haven't really been able to tell, if I'm perfectly honest, just from looking at your bio and things. But do you hold any particular religious convictions yourself, Adam?
I am not a Christian. I grew up and I am a part of the Jewish tradition. I don't think that enters very directly into the historical scholarship that I do, except that I think that it does give me the perspective, having grown up as a religious minority in a country, as I think allowed me to at least situate myself in the sense of sort of understanding how a diversity of religious interactions and philosophical interactions can and do square together, and how they can interact over reasons that have more to do with external factors than necessarily the nature of specific ideas themselves. Now, I want to clarify something based on Casey's response, because I think he's right that some of the Christian critics of intelligent design do say essentially that it doesn't go far enough, but some of them also say it's going the wrong way. And to some extent, those critics are actually, in some ways, truer to a tradition of what some people would call the theology of nature, that goes back for centuries, goes back really to at least Aquinas, in which the argument says, by understanding an argument for design in specific ways, or an argument for a creative, intelligent, and compassionate force in the universe through certain forms of evidence as opposed to others, we end up being able to do better theology down the road. So I'm going to point to William Paley, because I think he gets, I think his reputation is frequently maligned by sort of by both people like Richard Dawkins and Michael Behe, and how they talk about them in their books. In fact, during the Dover trial that we keep alluding to, witnesses on both sides compared intelligent design to the work of William Paley, and in ways that I think actually do a disservice to the historical record. For Paley, the argument really was that the world of created matter, so the objects that we see in nature, seem to show that they are well attuned to the natural laws. So there's two different things. There are natural laws, which are sort of fixed and immaterial, things like the law of gravity, the laws of optics. We might later on discover laws like the laws of heredity. We might eventually discover certain laws in psychology or neuroscience as well. There are also physical objects in the world, things like eyes, things like ears, things like watches. And what Paley says is essentially that the fact that the world of matter seems not just to obey the laws of nature, but seems to in some ways have some prior awareness of those laws of nature, is the compelling evidence not just that there was an intelligence designing behind that, but that intelligence is unified across the whole universe. It's the same laws of nature, whether we are talking about here on Earth or out in the heavens. It's the same laws of gravity. It's the same laws of optics, and it is the same. So therefore, there is one God. There is who is everywhere. In Paley's view, the adaptation of these parts seems to produce a well-functioning and well-ordered society, as well as well-functioning and well-ordered creatures, that he says, in a kind of utilitarian way, produces a surplus of happiness, of well-being. And this, to him, is proof that God is compassionate and good. I think that even though Paley considers arguments of sort of a more ad hoc, how could we argue from what Casey refers to as the negative arguments of intelligent design, which is to say the arguments that say this thing couldn't have come into being on its own, therefore it must have come into being some other way. Part of what Paley says is a God who would create in these obscure ways is not a God that we as human beings are capable of knowing more about. And so there are at least some Christians who, in Darwin's day, really loved the idea that evolution was a mechanism and a process through which the world was created. Charles Kingsley was one of the leaders in the Anglican Church in the 1850s and 60s. A friend of Darwin's wrote to him and said, I think that this view is not just at least as compatible as the idea of the special creation of different species, but may even provide a more glorious and noble vision of who God is.
And so are you saying, Adam, that Paley, in that sense, could have been sort of quite open to an evolutionary understanding because it wasn't completely at odds with his idea of the fitness of things, the way everything comes together in that sort of way?
I've argued that there are definitely some versions of theistic evolution that I think are following in Paley's tradition. People like Kingsley and Frederick Temple and a few other leaders in the Anglican Church in the immediate aftermath of Darwin's day, I think are carrying forth that tradition. The only time Paley is criticizing theories of evolution which were around in his own time, he does so really to say that the problem is the idea that there are no final causes in this picture. He's thinking particularly of Buffon, where you have sort of the spontaneous ex nihilo creation of new life, and of Erasmus Darwin, which is a more evolutionary picture, but which is one in which the created world itself is given the power of agency. In other words, creatures sort of will themselves into higher forms of evolution. And Paley didn't quite like that. I will say also that the one time Paley is mentioned by name in Darwin's Origin of Species, he's not criticizing Paley. He's using Paley as evidence in support of his argument. Because one of the concerns that Darwin raised was what he calls utilitarian objections, that a theory of natural selection causes so much suffering and pain and death to refined species that it seems like a philosophically miserable world. And he says Paley has shown that most adaptations in the natural world are to the benefit of the creatures that have them. So that's the one time he mentions Paley by name in the Origin of Species.
It's all fascinating background to in the historical context, and that's all important. In a way, of course, Casey, neither Paley nor Darwin knew what we know now about the way the DNA functions, and in a sense, he only saw a glob of goo, and he had this insight. But your argument, I suppose, Casey, and as I understand it, of the intelligent design movement generally, has been that the more we've learned about the way life in fact does arise and the kind of complexity that exists, the harder it is to apply a simple kind of Darwinian mechanism to how that complexity arose. So I've had conversations of various kinds. So this is one way of doing it. I've had people from the kind of so-called third way, the James Shapiros and others, those who are people who are questioning the kind of neo-Darwinian synthesis, but they're not sort of necessarily in the intelligent design camp. So the picture is always more complex than it's sometimes spelled out in the popular media, and I'm not going to attempt to have all the perspectives represented on any single show. But Casey, this is I suppose your opportunity to kind of bring us up to speed with the way you think. That's the history there, and Adam's very helpfully nuanced it and said it's not always as simple as some of the popular level readings put it. But where do you think we're at now? And this is your chance to tell us about who you think is actually crossing the line to the kind of intelligent design side of the pew, if you like.
Sure. So, I would say that I'm not a paleo expert. I'm not here to argue theology, but I can tell you that we are discovering many things using intelligent design. In fact, ID has had a scientific renaissance since the Dover trial. Over 100 peer-reviewed papers have been published in scientific journals. And ID has been transformed into a full-blown active research program. We call it ID 3.0, and we're funding multiple projects that are showing how intelligent design makes testable predictions and can serve as a guide or heuristic in a variety of different fields. And I can highlight some of the projects that we're funding right now. One of the projects we're funding is using intelligent design to build nanomachines that can kill cancer, bacteria, and even viruses. And this has implications for evolving the first cell. And papers from this project have been published in journals like Nature, ACS Applied Materials, and Nature Nanotechnology. One of the predictions of intelligent design is that we will find new layers of information and code in biology. And so one of the key interests of intelligent design is how information might be compressed. And we've been funding research into what we call overlapping genes, where there might be multiple overlapping reading frames where along a single strand of DNA, there are 3 reading frames on the sense strand and potentially 3 more on the anti-sense strand. So that means that along any stretch of DNA, you could have up to 6 different reading frames encoding 6 different proteins. This would be like having a sentence that has meaning, but if you start the sentence at one letter over from the beginning of the sentence, you get a new sentence with a totally different meaning. Or if you read it backwards, you find that there's a totally different sentence that comes out. This would imply a huge level of information compression and new layers of code. And we are finding these overlapping genes do exist in biology. It's really difficult to understand how an unguided process could produce this level of information compression. And we've published papers from this project in journals like Scientific Reports, Frontiers in Microbiology, Biosystems, BMC Evolutionary Biology, and Molecular Biology and Evolution. We even used this project to identify a protein in the SARS-CoV-2 genome that no one else had identified. Okay, so we are actually helping to contribute to the efforts to combat COVID because ID predicted we would find things like overlapping genes in the genome, whereas an unguided evolutionary perspective didn't expect to find that kind of information compression. Another project we're funding is called the Waiting Times Project, where we're looking at whether or not there's enough time in the fossil record to evolve new complex features like eyesight or feathers or whale adaptations for an aquatic lifestyle. This project published a paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology last year, authored by Ola Hoster, a mathematician at the University of Stockholm in Sweden, another high-level convert to intelligent design. Gunter Beckley was another co-author on this paper. Gunter Beckley is an interesting case. He's a paleontologist in Austria who was a curator of invertebrate fossils at a major museum in Germany. And he was preparing the 2009 bicentennial Darwin Day exhibit for this museum. He was a full-blown Darwinist. He did not have any, support for intelligent design. And as he was preparing this exhibit, he wanted to show that the weight of the evidence was against intelligent design. So he started reading ID books, and lo and behold, he realized that many of the supposed refutations of intelligent design that he had heard didn't hold up, that the argument was actually very much on the side of intelligent design. So he ended up becoming a supporter of intelligent design, first privately and then later publicly. And Justin, you mentioned that it's very difficult for ID proponents who are sort of out of the closet to survive in the academy. That's absolutely correct. As soon as Gunter Beckley came out publicly as an ID proponent, he was subject to harassment and various forms of marginalization and persecution at the museum he was at in Germany. And eventually he was forced to resign. He now works with us at Discovery Institute. And he's a great guy, a lot of fun to work with, and he's helping to oversee this waiting times project. And by the way, if you think that intelligent design arguments are not making an impact, 2 of the 3 most popular articles from the Journal of Theoretical Biology, a very mainstream journal over the last couple years, were about intelligent design arguments, okay? One of them was this article about the waiting times, creating a mathematical model, seeing if we can test the evolvability of various structures. And another paper by Ola Hoster and Steinar Thorvaldsen came out in September of 2020, which basically reviewed arguments for intelligent design, both at the fine-tuning of the universe and also fine-tuning in biology. And these papers have gained a lot of traction. There's been a lot of interest in these. So we have to say there is a real scientific dialogue going on over intelligent design, and we are making real scientific converts. I'll give one last example because I could go on for days, both about the people that are coming out of the woodwork supporting intelligent design, and I'm talking literally just about the tip of the iceberg. For every public ID proponent that there is, Justin, I'm not exaggerating when I say this. There are dozens and dozens of private ID proponents, some of them at some of the very highest levels of the scientific community, including Nobel Prize winners, who are afraid to come out publicly and say that they sympathize with ID arguments, okay? There are many people who are afraid to speak out. But one of the other...
Give us your final example here.
One of the other projects is called the Engineering Research Group, where a large consortium of over 50 biologists and engineers are coming together applying principles from the field of systems biology, where basically biologists are realizing that if you view biological systems as being designed in a top-down manner, rather than having evolved gradually in a bottom-up manner, then you can make more sense of what is going on in biology. Essentially, viewing biological systems as teleologically endowed and designed from the top down gets you much further in terms of understanding biology. And so we're seeing this in terms of testing ID arguments that we can find function for junk DNA, a successful prediction of intelligent design, and making sense of how molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum operate. We can go on and on about the successful testable predictions of intelligent design. This is literally, I've given you 4 examples out of, 18 different research projects that are actively going on right now in the ID movement. And there's a very active research program. And I would encourage folks, especially if you're a student, to check out Discovery Institute's summer seminar on intelligent design. It's a great way to learn more about these projects and get involved with ID research.
Okay, Casey, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so a lot of examples given there, Adam, of people, projects, research that's going on. As far as Casey says, this all amounts to very much intelligent design is not in retreat. It is advancing. What's your perspective on that?
So I don't want to speak to the specific merits of any scientific paper because I want to stay within my own lane. And I'm not a biologist. I'm not a molecular scientist. That's not something there are plenty of other people I think who are much more qualified to speak to the merits and implications of those papers than I will, and I'm not going to speculate about it. But if you recall at the beginning, I mentioned the idea that there's a lot of slipperiness in terms of what we call intelligent design. There's the theological slipperiness between people saying intelligent design is anything that's not atheism, or intelligent design is anything that's not explicitly biblically oriented Christianity. But there's also a broader sense in which intelligent design is doing both the work of argumentation for the existence of a designer and the work of sort of illustration. And this is actually something I know Casey kind of appreciated the historical background. The coda to that historical background is that over time, and especially in the period after Darwin, what we call natural theology began to look a lot less like arguments for and against or a God and about the nature of God, and looked a lot more like, if you will, kind of religiously respectable versions of popular science for Sunday school, if you will. In other words, a lot of things that really, and in some cases, recycled old works of natural theology to discuss the many rich examples from that work, from Paley, from John Ray, and from so on, and said, "Here's an example of this amazing thing in nature," and then saying, "And the Lord God doth create it all." And there's sort of a rhetorical move between saying, "Here is this amazing and impressive thing," the wow factor, this attempt to sort of go right past the logical argument and appeal directly to sort of something deeper inside of you and say, "Here is this amazing thing that is happening, and here is this thing that we're doing science to understand. We're understanding more about cosmology. We're understanding more about biology." And to me, that means that God's behind it all, right? From the point of view of these kinds of sort of pious popular science, this was a rhetorical move. The idea was, you weren't convincing the atheist or the non-believer. What you were doing was you were providing a background in science to people who were already sort of within a certain faith tradition. I think that to some extent, and Casey, I think at least in some of the examples that you cited, you said, here is this prediction that we make, which is a scientific bit of evidence, and then you say, and therefore there can be no way that this could have originated except but for some sort of supernatural intelligence. And I think some critics would say that there is a little bit of a slip between here is the illustration of nature that is this impressive, amazing thing, these overlapping genes, and then to say that therefore, because the world is so amazing, there is a designer behind it. I think that there is a danger of that, whether it is something that the people who are publishing these papers are intending, or whether this is how the people who are working from these papers are reading.
Yeah, I mean, if that is what intelligent design we're arguing, I would disagree with it as well, Adam. And I would encourage our listeners right now to pause the YouTube video, go back to how I articulated the argument for design at the beginning of this show, and see if it matches the way Adam just described it. I hate to say it, but that is a straw man caricature. In fact, it's the exact straw man caricature that Judge Jones used in the Dover trial, which was also a blatant, inaccurate description of how intelligent design operates. Every one of these projects, these peer-reviewed or these research projects I'm talking about, is finding evidence of specified complexity in nature. And we observe from our observations of the world around us that specified complexity derives from an intelligent source. I'm not saying that I can prove to you that a supernatural being created the bacterial flagellum. What I am saying, though, is that in our experience, the kind of information and complexity, the language-rich code that encodes the bacterial flagellum, the irreducibly complex molecular machinery that the flagellum entails, in all of our experience with the flagellum, or with the origin of that kind of information and complexity, it always traces back to a mind or a personal agent. Now, if I were to go further and say that, it's a divine designer, I would be going beyond what the raw evidence from nature can tell us. But we do know from our observations of the world around us that high levels of specified complexity, language-based code, machine-like structures always derive from an intelligent source. So I'm arguing for an intelligent cause. I'm not saying we can go further. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you, Adam, there, but I do feel like it's important to be very precise. The principle of charity and sort of letting your opponents define their own position is very important. I think you're a very decent guy, Adam. Of everything I've seen about you, you're a very thoughtful guy. But unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation about intelligent design out there, and it's very to slip into saying that, we're arguing that because this is complex, therefore supernatural God did it. I'm not saying that you can make that argument. I'm saying, though, that you can conclude that this feature of nature had an intelligent cause.
And I guess I want to know from you, Adam, and feel free to make your own response, but this is, for me, at the center of the intelligent design claim, is that there's equally an equal and opposite sort of perspective, which is let's say the Richard Dawkins sort of perspective that evolution, science, and so on supports atheism. That there's equally a kind of atheistic perspective that kind of goes along with. So, for me, the question is there not equally the danger that there's going to be scientists out there who simply dismiss any, for where design is not allowed on the table because they've got a atheistic presupposition about the world, that it has to have some naturalistic cause, and so on. There is that danger, if you like, of a kind of almost semi-religious perspective from that side just as much as there might be a danger of it from a Christian who wants to see design in everything at the same time.
I think, and I want to maybe take a step back to clarify a little bit, because I certainly don't mean to distort what Casey is saying his own arguments are. And I want to say that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if the proponents of intelligent design become essentially something like the kinds of religiously inflected science popularizers that we have seen both in the past and we do see also in the present. And I think that some of the articles that are published on the Discovery Institute's Evolution News website really do have that flavor, where it's not necessarily about making a specific argument for the complex specified information. I keep wanting to say CSI as if this were a crime show. But a lot of them also look like the flavor of, here we are trying to present to you a primer on science, which in itself is not necessarily controversial, to an audience that we have access to that other people might not have access to, or who will take information from us more seriously. I think that is a really valid thing, especially in the current climate where we are in, where information about public health is unfortunately politicized, and in which people might not be willing to understand how vaccines work, but might read Michael Behe explaining how vaccines work on Evolution News. I don't take that a post like that as necessarily being an argument about for or against intelligent design, as much as taking advantage of a platform that the Discovery Institute has. That's something that, so when I was saying this is something that natural theology has done in the past, what I'm saying is that I think that that's actually, in some ways, if we want to look at a place where intelligent design advances, it might be a question of using and leveraging the platform that it has in that way. I do think that in terms of the public outreach and in terms of the wider public interest, we do see a lot less discussion of intelligent design in sort of the mainstream media, in the news, than we did during the height of the Dover trial. You know, I sometimes joke that I have a Google News alert set up for intelligent design, and aside from news articles put out by the Discovery Institute, almost everything I see there is describing a new car or new linens or teaching me about interior decorating, which is fantastic. I love learning about that stuff. In fact, Casey, you said that you're doing ID 3.0. I think Volkswagen has a car called the ID4, which is actually using the phrase intelligent design. I think this shows up in my spam box all the time. But I think the flip side of that news alert is to say people aren't talking about intelligent design in the public sphere as much as they were 15 years ago. And Casey, I'd be curious to hear from you why that is.
Well, let's come back to that after a quick break, Casey. Just out of time in this section of the show. And yes, it'd be interesting to hear whether that, you know, whether the fact that obviously things have quietened down a bit in the public sphere since Dover bespeaks, you know, the whole area sort of going through a lull or not. Obviously, from what you said, you don't think that's the case, but we'll come back to it. We're talking about the intelligent design movement on the advance or in retreat. We've been asking today. My guests are Casey Luskin and Adam Shapiro. We'll be back in just a moment. In an increasingly secular and sceptical world, it can often feel like faith is under threat. But faith isn't simply blind belief. It's trusting in something we have good evidence for. I believe that in recent years, Christianity has undergone a revival of its intellectual tradition, and a new generation of believers is emerging, equipped to engage the world with all of their heart, soul, and mind for Jesus. My name's Justin Briley, and I'd like to introduce you to Confident Christianity, an apologetics course from Unbelievable and Premier that will help you to understand the evidence for God and answer objections to faith. We've been talking about intelligent design on the show today. I am going to make sure there are links to both my guests from today's show. You can find out more about Casey at the Discovery Institute and the comprehensive guide to science and faith that he has edited from his website. That's caseyluskin.com. You can find links to Adam Shapiro's new book, the second edition of Science and Religion, a very short introduction from today's show as well. So do make sure to go and check those out, get a hold of their books. In that last section, Casey, Adam was just saying that he does, though, just at a general level in the public sphere, he sees a lot less alerts when it comes to intelligent design. Not as much interest in the whole area since the Dover Kitzmiller trial and so on. Is that just a factor of the news cycle moving on, or do you think it does sort of perhaps suggest that, people have kind of moved on a bit from intelligent design? What do you make of that, Casey?
Well, I mean, I do agree with Adam that there are fewer calls from the New York Times, per month on average at Discovery Institute than there was in 2005 when the President of the United States endorsed teaching intelligent design in public schools. And that certainly created a lot of hubbub and a lot of controversy. So, I mean, absolutely, Adam, you're right that maybe as far as the news cycle goes, ID doesn't appear quite as much, but that does not mean that an interest in intelligent design is waning, especially from the people where it really matters. I would say if you want to take superficial criteria like the science press or the popular press, then maybe one could argue that ID is in retreat since Dover. If you only look at the number of newspaper articles or Google searches. But if you want to look at if you want to talk about SEO stats, let's look at other metrics to look at popular interest in ID on the internet. Just before Christmas of 2021, Stephen Meyer, one of the leading ID theorists, had 5 videos on intelligent design that came out at Prager University, Intelligent Design and Science Faith Issues. That in just about, that's a little over 3 months since those came out. They have a combined total of over 8.8 million views since that time. Discovery Institute's YouTube channel has quite a few series. Our Science Uprising series has over 3.4 million views. Our 5 molecular machine animations have over 1.4 million views. Discovery Institute's John West produced a documentary titled Human Zoos, which explained the historical use and misuse of evolution to justify repugnant racist policies in the USA. It has over 3.5 million views and won awards at the African World Film Documentary Film Festival, the Oregon Documentary Film Festival, Cinema World Fest Awards, and the Hollywood Independent Documentary Awards. So, if you want to gauge ID's interest just by the number of New York Times articles that come out, I don't know if that's the right way to do it. Stephen Meyer's 2013 book, Darwin's Doubt, was a New York Times bestseller. Okay, so we've seen huge successes in intelligent design in the post-Dover world. Meanwhile, ID is spreading to other countries. In May of this year, there's a conference taking place at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, where high-level ID proponents and ID critics and folks, everything in between, are going to be discussing important topics like the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of the genetic code, and the origin of proteins. And 2 Nobel Prize winners are speaking there. Right now, as we speak in Africa, one of our fellows, Paul Nelson, is on a tour of Nigeria and Kenya, where interest in intelligent design is growing by leaps and bounds. He's speaking to various academics at universities there right now. And in Brazil, over the past 5 or so, 6 years, we've seen a number of Brazilian ID congresses hosted, headed by Marcos Eberlin, who is a member of the Brazilian National Academy of Sciences, another high-level convert to intelligent design, one of the world leaders in the area of mass spectrometry, and he's helped organize these Brazilian ID congresses that regularly get dozens, if not over 100 scientists at them. And because there's more academic freedom in Brazil on this topic than other countries, the scientists there have the freedom to go and actually participate. And they're doing research in Brazil right now on some ID projects, redoing the Stanley Miller experiment, looking at the human versus chimp proteome. So there's a lot of exciting activities for intelligent design going on around the world. And I would say if we just look at the superficial metric of, New York Times articles, you're not going to get a really complete picture of what's going on in intelligent design.
You don't look too enthusiastic about it, though, Adam.
Well, I honestly am excited.
Well, Casey is. I can see you're excited, Casey. But Adam, you don't look like you're too enthusiastic about all these advances.
It's not a question of enthusiasm. I think it's a question of what we're reading into those metrics. I think that getting beyond the metrics, I think there is this question about both how intelligent design is used in the public sphere. And I think when you first approached me and asked the question about is intelligent design in advance or in decline, one of the real questions I had sort of unpacking that was whether we were talking about the way that people who are researching and doing the work that Casey and his group at the Discovery Institute are doing consider their work versus is it in advance or in decline in a larger public sphere? Given everything we know about social media metrics, I'm a little bit wary of sort of touting those numbers. I think we've seen plenty of debates about how algorithms feed that sort of material. But more importantly, I think, is that whether this is in advance or in decline, is to recognize that, um, as we say frequently in our book, sometimes the changes that happen with issues in religion and science change not because of new discoveries in the science or new ideas in the religion. They change because the political and social circumstances change. And I think the world of today looks very different than the world of 2008 when the book came out, of a few years earlier when the Dover trial concluded. Probably most important for those of us in the United States, at least, is that the legal questions about what place religion or science have in the classroom is being reshaped by new ways of thinking about religious freedom that the courts have been ruling on in recent years. One of the real debates that was going on in Dover was about whether intelligent design counted as a science, not because there's a law that says you have to teach science, but because the courts had settled on a principle that said a way for us to tell whether or not something constitutes an inappropriate government endorsement of religion is whether or not the thing that they're endorsing is or isn't a science. So the debate over science and demarcation became a proxy for the constitutional debate about religious establishment. Over the past few years, I think we have seen the direction that American courts have been taking has shifted away from focusing on this Establishment Clause restriction and more on expanding the notion of religious freedom to give individual teachers and individual school boards a wider latitude of saying that they will teach things as it squares with their personal religious beliefs. Now, this raises some questions when those individuals are acting as agencies of the state and how the balance between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause is negotiated. But I think we can both agree that the courts clearly have been expanding the view of the scope of the Free Exercise Clause in recent years. That religious freedom is being viewed not only as a fundamental right, which it always has been, but that it is in some ways a more fundamental right than, say, certain laws that protect civil rights. And so we can debate over whether or not that's good policy. What I think that has done, though, is reduce the legal necessity for something that looks like a science to be proposed as an alternative to evolution for teachers in the classroom. So it doesn't really matter whether intelligent design is a science. If a biology teacher in a high school here in Pennsylvania doesn't want to teach evolution, they have probably a little bit more latitude to get away with doing that without explicitly saying, here is the scientific alternative I want to teach. And in the absence of that legal necessity, I think we are seeing less of a need for people
I'm not
to
sure.
look at...
I do advise a lot of teachers on how to teach the issue. For example, the Levate case said that if a teacher does not want to teach evolution because of whatever their views are, they can be required to do that by an administrator. Academic freedom is very limited for K through 12 public school teachers. The Epperson case effectively said that if you don't teach evolution, you're going to be viewed with extreme suspicion of having religious motives and unconstitutional motives. So I would be, as an attorney, I'd be wary to tell a teacher, I tell them that they should teach evolution and they should teach it objectively, teach the evidence that's in the curriculum supporting evolution, but also teach the evidence that challenges evolution, but don't get into intelligent design. That's basically what we advise teachers. But I agree with you that there have been shifts in the culture, Adam, absolutely. But I think that intelligent design is not going away. The amount of interest we see from students and scientists that are coming out of the woodwork to contact us at Discovery Institute, the 600 plus students that have gone through our summer seminar, many of them now junior faculty, PhDs, postdocs that are doing ID research. What this tells me is that the fundamentals of the intelligent design movement are very strong and that intelligent design is not going away. So I don't know. I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen in political debates or science religion debates in the future. You probably have a better read on that than I do, Adam. But I can definitely say that intelligent design is going to be a part of those conversations because we are growing as a movement. Our research program is growing. We're publishing peer-reviewed papers more and more every year. Our peer-reviewed publication rate almost has an exponential shape when you look at the number of papers we publish each year. So I'm very bullish on the future of intelligent design. And whatever the New York Times has to say, I think our fundamentals are sound.
Final thoughts, Adam, from you?
You know, I, as a historian, I am always wary of trying to look in the other direction temporally. I agree that when we get around to a third edition, there will still be discussion of intelligent design. I think that will still be part of the conversation that we are having.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I'm sure we'll have it again here on Unbelievable. But for now, thank you very much, Casey and Adam, for being with me. Again, links to both the books that we've mentioned. You can find Casey's book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science of Faith, with a link from today's show at his website. And likewise, you can find the co-authored book by Adam Shapiro, The Science and Religion, A Very Short Introduction, links to that as well. But for now, Casey and Adam, thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.